Welcome to the Backwoods Horror Stories podcast. The stories you are about to hear are real. At least they are to the people who experience them. These stories are meant to entertain you. But remember, they happen to real people. So the next time you venture out into the woods alone, don't forget to keep a flashlight handy. You don't want to end up starring in your own backwoods horror story. Now turn down the lights. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
It was all set up to be a fun camping trip. My 4 buddies and I were looking forward to swimming, fishing, drinking beer, and shooting the breeze around the fire at night. A long weekend off from work, surrounded by nature. It was one of the things we all had in common. We loved the outdoors. We loaded up my truck with the majority of what we would need, and my other buddies piled into their vehicles, and we were off. We left early that Friday morning so that we could get up to the campsite in time to get everything set up, tents and whatnot, We went fishing shortly after we got there and had everything ready for that night. We spent a few hours out at the water, swimming, catching fish, and looking at the scenery. That night, we started a fire, fried the fish we caught, and sat around talking. The sun had gone down by then, and it was pitch dark unless you were right up on the fire or not too far away from it. My buddy had gone to take a leak, so he took the flashlight with him, found a tree reasonably close to the campground, and did his business, and then came back. I say maybe 30 minutes went by, and we were all laughing and carrying on, and I felt a pine cone hit the front of my leg. I thought my buddy did it when I wasn't looking, but he swore it wasn't him. I dismissed it, and we went on talking. Not too long afterward, an acorn hit my friend in the back. We didn't hear any noises like walking or anything that would indicate someone was over there, so we just assumed that it had fallen out of the tree. After the acorn, I just started thinking that maybe the pine cone that hit my leg was for the same reason. It just fell out of the tree and I was under it when it hit. We went to bed, I guess around midnight or a little after. We had the fire almost knocked down, but it was going just enough to hopefully deter any critters from coming into the campsite. It was a still evening, so there wouldn't be any wind that would be blowing that would make leaving it going a fire hazard. I woke up, I guess around 4, I want to say. It was still dark, but the tent was constantly being hit with small rocks and acorns. I must admit, my heart was racing a little bit. But I was curious, so I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and went outside the tent. Nothing. No noises except for my friends' loud snoring from their tents. The fire had completely burned out at this point. I shone my flashlight around beside my tent and found at least 10 or 12 acorns that had been thrown. They were all piled up next to where I was sleeping on the other side. No doubt, this is what woke me up. I was confused, but as I looked around our camp, nothing else had been disturbed. I brushed it off, went back in my tent, and went back to sleep. That next morning, I had brought it up over breakfast. My buddies all said they didn't hear anything, and if anything had hit the sides of their tents, they were oblivious to it. They slept all night. We went out hiking that day, and I admit, I was a little more on guard than I probably would have been had that not happened the night before. It just didn't make any sense to me. What would be throwing small rocks and acorns at the tent I was in and not the other tents where my friends were sleeping? A little way into our hike, a friend of mine in general conversation asked if we felt like something was watching us. He said it was almost as if everywhere we went, we had eyes on us. One of my other friends agreed, and he said it was creeping him out. Now, as I said, we love the outdoors and nature. For any of us to feel creeped out outside is odd, but that made 3 of the 5 of us who had now experienced something. There was definitely something on our trail. We knew it. One of my biggest fears at the time was that it was a large cat eyeing us from above somewhere. We made our way back to the water's edge to catch more fish. We had a clear line of sight from one side of the water to the other. As we sat there, we saw movement across on the other side. Small and intermittent at first, just enough to catch our attention. But then, the trees really started swaying. We could hear the bark breaking on the trees across the river. Small cracks, then larger, then louder cracks. That's when something fully bent a tree completely over. The bark snapped and popped loudly, almost echoing across the water. "What the hell is that?" my buddy asked as he pointed. "That looks like a bear," my other friend said in reply. He was the most skeptical of the 5 of us. He was our scientific friend. He was known for his nerdology, as we called it. "It's nothing more than a bear, you guys. You're making a whole lot out of nothing," he scoffed. "Ain't no way. That's way bigger than a bear, our other friend said. I get it. Bears mess with trees. But have you ever seen a bear completely bend a tree over like that? He was right. Whatever we were looking at was way bigger than a bear. Its movements were very fluid as well. Bears are big, bustling animals, burly and loud. This thing was almost gliding through the trees. It casually walked off after making a spectacle with the trees. We sat there and watched it until it was out of sight. We watched it, and we also were feeling it, watching us. After we caught some fish to hold us over until we left the next day, we hiked back to camp, still talking about what we saw and trying to figure out what it could have been. Well, there's no way that you can convince me that what we saw was a bear. I won't believe it, I said as I stoked more kindling in the fire. So are you going to try to convince me that that was a Bigfoot pulling those trees down trying to scare us away? My skeptical friend asked me. That thought had never occurred to me until he brought it up, and for once, I appreciated his skepticism. Of course, I said loudly. That makes all the sense in the world now. He just rolled his eyes at my comment and continued to clean the fish. Hey, you really don't think that was a Bigfoot, do you? My other friend asked me later. Think about it, I said. You went and took a leak on that tree last night. Right after, I got hit with a pine cone, and you got hit with an acorn. It's almost like it was taking a territorial stance with us. Right, I can see that, but I thought all that came from the tree we were sitting under. Well, and it could have been. I'm not dismissing that as a possibility. That would be idiotic. What I'm saying is the totality of the circumstances as a whole. I get hit with the pine cone, and then you the acorn. Then, in the middle of the night, I get awoken by acorns pelting the side of my tent. Then today, feeling as though we were being watched, then we went fishing. We saw that, whatever it was, across the river, I explained. All of my buddies, with the exception of one, were starting to put the pieces together and see how everything I was saying made sense. Can we please get the fish fry going? My skeptical friend said, sounding slightly annoyed. Our catch of fish for the day wasn't the greatest, so we snacked on various things that we'd brought as well. Peanuts in the shell, chips, jerky, that sort of thing. With the fire going, we tossed all the peanut shells into the flames and listened as they made the loud cracks. We had a black trash bag from the night before that we kept in a separate cooler to try to keep raccoons and whatnot out, so all the garbage went into that. After everything had been cleaned up as much as possible, we turned in for the evening. I don't know what time exactly it was that I woke up. I just know that it was still pitch black outside. The fire was still going just enough to cast shadows. I heard something rustling around the camp, and it must have woken me up. I slowly and quietly looked out the sides of the tent, trying to see through the thin fabric. I couldn't unzip it because the noise would startle whatever it was, and if I used the Velcro window to look through the mesh covering, it would cause the same outcome. I was sure that it was a raccoon that had finally made its way into camp, drawn in by the smell of fish and snacks. But I was sorely mistaken, because what I saw through the fabric of my tent was the furthest thing from a raccoon. What I saw was a large, broad figure standing upright going through our cooler. This thing was huge. It was so tall and so wide, there was no way that it could be a human. My heart began to race, and all I could hope for is that my friends were awake and seeing what I was. There wouldn't be any way that they'd believe me otherwise. I swear it looked like a really tall human. It had similar features, shoulder, a wide chest, thin in the waist, but it didn't have a neck. Really, that was the only difference. No neck, and the head was a little off as far as the shape goes. And I could also see slight shadows of hair draping from its body. Mainly when it reached its arms into the cooler, I could see the hair hanging down. The only problem was we hadn't seen any other people the whole time we'd been there, and certainly nobody who looked like this. I lay there watching this shadow slightly moving. It had to have had thumbs. It was digging around in the cooler with a black trash bag in it, so it had to have thumbs to open the latch. It was pulling up fish bones, chip bags, beer cans, and water bottles and tossing them all on the ground. It reminded me of a homeless person scavenging for anything it could find. As one of the beer cans fell loudly to the ground, I heard one of my friends jump and gasp. Awesome, I thought. If they weren't awake before, they are now. Well, at least one of them. Then all of a sudden, a new fear crept over me. What if they opened their tent? So I just laid there in the dark, hoping that somehow I could telepathically send them a message for them not to open the tent. But before I had a chance to worry about that for too long, a loud knock came from somewhere in the distance, then another, and then another. With that, this, whatever it was, took off. The cooler fell to the ground with a loud thud, and the remaining contents of the cooler spilled out all over the ground. The loud clangs from the beer cans hitting each other echoed through the woods. The sound of the knock and the noise this creature made while running off was enough to cause the rest of my buddies to stir. That's when I heard the slow unzipping from a tent beside me. I figured it would be okay at this point, so I unzipped mine as well and cautiously stuck my head out. We all slowly came out of our tents and looked around the campsite as well as at each other, almost for validation that really did happen and we all actually witnessed it. Please tell me you guys saw and heard that as we all stood around staring into the flames of our dwindling fire. I know I did, and I wish I wouldn't have, one of my buddies said as he was putting his hands into the pockets of his shorts. I don't know if I'll ever feel the same about these woods again. That changed everything for me too. I mean, knowing something like that is truly out there, I said. And the scary thing is, there has to be more of them. There had to be another one out there that made that knock. No doubt it had to have been watching us this whole time, and I bet that's what we saw earlier in the day by the water. And maybe that's what I felt like was watching us on our hike earlier as well, my other buddy chimed in. I'm sure that more than one of them has been watching us, I said. My other two friends were silent, pale, and not uttering a word. They didn't have to. Their silence said it all. My skeptical buddy, who has always had an answer for everything, didn't. What we saw, what we all saw, isn't supposed to exist. Did I believe in them? Yes. Was I open about that? No. Too much ridicule about that these days. You can say that you believe in an extremely large ape-like creature living in the forest of America and beyond, but until you actually see it in person, that doesn't have the same effect. It's completely different. It's almost an emotional experience. Whatever that emotion may be for you, fear, elation, sadness, etc. I know for us, it was a range. Mostly, though, we didn't know if we would be able to go back out into the woods after this experience. How many times has this happened before in other places we had been to? We had to start questioning all of it now. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We sat by the fire for what seemed like hours. It was probably in reality only about an hour or so. We were quiet with only a few words spoken between us. The rest of the night was silent. No movement, no rocks, no small animals scurrying around, nothing. We were all relieved when the sun came up over the horizon, finally shedding light on our campsite. Now we could have a look around to see what else this thing might have messed with. I told everybody to make sure they watched where they stepped as I made my way over near my truck where this thing had been standing. What exactly are we looking for? Footprints, I said. They'll be most notable in the soft dirt. Something that large would have had to leave some kind of track, I said, as I headed towards the cooler that was still laying on the ground. We all looked like actual researchers searching for anything we could find. My skeptical friend was in absolute bliss. His nerdology went into full effect. The cooler lay on the ground with the black bag partially sticking out. The smell was horrible and it reeked of the remnants of the fish we had caught the past 2 days. I bet that's what got it in here, my friend said. We've been cooking on that fire and that smell has been going through these woods. I'm surprised that nothing else came in to check it out, honestly. After checking out the area in and around the campsite, we didn't find any real proof that the animal had been there. Scattered trash, a bent latch on my cooler. But it's like when it left, it scattered all the dirt on the ground in the process, and any track it left just disappeared. The only thing we did find was a branch it had broken as it tore out of camp. But that's circumstantial. Anything could have broken that. But we knew it wasn't just anything. We knew that we saw something, and it wasn't some hallucination that we all shared. Our main thing was proving it. But you know how that goes. You find a hair, a footprint, scat, and it's always bare or it's been contaminated and the results come back human. Then you have the cost of those tests, and that just gets frustrating. I believed it before I saw it. I mean, I won't lie. I would sometimes tell myself there's no way something like that could exist, and then something new would come out and it would change my mind. But this right here, there's no going back from this. We saw it. We laid eyes on it. We were less than 10 feet from it. But we all knew when we left that day, we wouldn't be able to tell anyone else about this. This event would be something that we only shared with each other. Marine base fires on a Sasquatch creature. I want to remain anonymous due to the nature of this story. See, I was in the Marine Corps. No, I wasn't any special forces or anything unique per se. I was just a rank and file Marine. I was stationed at 29 Palms Marine Corps Air Combat Training Center, MCA-GCT for short. I wasn't the only one who has seen and experienced things in the training grounds and the surrounding areas. I was told to keep my mouth shut, but I'm going to die soon anyway, so even if they do come for me, it isn't going to make that big of a difference. It was during early April, so the weather wasn't that bad. It wasn't hot during the day and it wasn't cold at night. I always enjoyed doing field ops during that time of year. I got away from doing the dumb shit that we had to do day in and day out back on the main side, and I was typically left to my own devices while out in the field. So late one night, me and a buddy of mine are doing fire watch from our section of the rest area. We had our rifles, plate carriers, helmets, and our NVGs, night vision goggles, mounted on the front, and our rifles with us. We also had 4 mags apiece of live ammo. That night, an artillery battalion was doing night practice, so we'd hear the echo of the guns followed by the sound of the shells hitting the ground and exploding. It sounded like far-off thunder. Me and my friend were talking about just random crap when I flipped down my NVGs and saw something moving out in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the green tint of my goggles messing with my head, but then I saw it again. I tapped my buddy and asked him if he was seeing the same thing. He flipped down his NVGs and nodded. Yeah, but what is it? A coyote, he asked? No, too big to be a coyote. Besides, it looks like it's running around on 2 legs, I said back to him. That's when he tapped me and pointed out into the dark. There's more than one, bro, he said. I looked to where he was pointing, and that's when I saw 4 or 5 other figures darting around in the dark. These things weren't that big. I'd say maybe around 5'5", give or take. They also appeared to be very strong and built with massive arms and leg muscles. They were dark and their skin looked leathery. They had very big dark eyes and no nose to speak of. Their mouth was wide and filled with razor-sharp teeth. They walked around hunched over with their arms dangling by their sides. Their arms themselves were massive. They ran at insane speeds, occasionally running on all 4s. They had 4 fingers on each hand and their claws were long and sharp. It was like they had daggers for nails. Dude, I think they're getting closer. I nodded. Yeah, I'm going to get the corporal up. He nodded and I raced over to where the corporal was sleeping and shook him awake. Hey man, there's something going on out there. You need to come take a look. He cursed under his breath and he said this better be good as he sat up. That's when we heard gunfire. I raced back to my buddy who was frantically shooting into the dark. I looked out into the darkness and I saw these creatures maybe 300 to 400 yards away. As other Marines had woken up to the sound of my buddy shooting, the OIC, officer in charge, came running up to ask what was going on. When we pointed out to the creatures, he froze in place. About this time, we heard tons of gunfire suddenly erupt from another unit that was conducting training in the area as well. When I looked back at where these things were, they were no longer there. Instead, they were running on all 4s directly at us. I raised my rifle and began to fire at them, and those with guns and ammo joined in, and the others who didn't ran back to get theirs. I lined up my sights with the closest one and began to fire into it. I saw chunks of its flesh get ripped off when I hit it. It tumbled down, and without missing a beat, it regained its balance and kept sprinting at us. At this point, I knew our rifles were useless, but I wasn't going to leave my buddy. That's when I heard the OIC yelling for us to get into the trucks and get the hell out of there and get back to the main side. Me and my friend turned and booked it to our 7-ton. I flipped on the battery switch and my buddy cranked the truck. As we began to start moving, I looked out the window just in time to see one of these things reach our camp. A Marine who hadn't realized what was going on until it was too late was impaled by one of these creatures' claws and he fell to the ground. I watched him try to crawl away, but this thing leaned over and bit his upper torso and head completely off with a single bite. As we began to turn out, I saw a Humvee that had 3 of these things racing towards it. The guy in the turret tried to flip around the 50 cal and unload on these creatures, but he wasn't fast enough, and one of them ripped him out of the turret and flung him to the others. He didn't have time to move before this thing sank its claws into his chest and began to eat him. I watched as the thing on top of the Humvee then jumped down onto the hood, shattered the bullet-resistant glass, and then pulled out the mangled corpse of the driver and ran off into the desert with him. The remaining 3 Marines got out and ran for our truck. I tapped my buddy to let them get on, but they never made it. One by one, these things picked them off, their screams fading off into the desert. By the time we got back onto the main road to the main side and caught up with the rest of our unit, we noticed how active the night sky had become. There were helicopters everywhere with searchlights. We figured someone had called it in and they were trying to find the creatures or the missing Marines. Well, What was left of them anyway? When we were next up at the checkpoint, I noticed something about the guys manning it. They wore all black with black ski masks over their face and their NVGs down. They didn't have any patches, name tapes, or identification with them. They were armed to the teeth, though. One of our vehicles had a minigun mounted on it. They all carried high-powered rifles with high-tech sights, laser sights, and other attachments on them. When it was our turn, they had us step out of the truck and tell them what we saw. After we explained everything, the guy in charge looked at my friend and listed off his full name, date of birth, social security number, where his mom and dad were, and the name of the dog that he had when he was in middle school. He then looked at me and did the same thing. Once he was done, he looked at both of us. If you mutter a word about what you actually saw here tonight, you and your families will disappear for good. Do you understand? We both nodded with our jaws on the floor. The guy had mentioned things that I'd never told anyone about. He then told us that if anybody asked about the group of Marines, they went off to get something and wound up getting lost. With that, they sent us back to the main side of the base. I got out about a year later, but I never went back out on another field op again. To this day, I still relive that night, each night when I go to bed. I just hope that whoever those men were, they killed those things so no more Marines have to go out like that. In short, if you're ever stationed in 29 Palms, California, and you go out on a field op, keep an eye out in the dark and be sure you aren't far away from a vehicle. And pray these things don't decide to turn you into a meal. Update on the story. As many of you may have seen the other story I posted on here, something is hunting U.S. Marines in the California desert. While that one might just be creepypasta, it was based on an actual experience I had. Back in September of 2017, I was on a field op with my unit out in one of the training grounds in 29 Palms. For any active duty guys or vets that were stationed at 29 Palms, you know weird things happen in the training grounds of that base. We were way out there at the time. I want to say maybe an hour or so drive back to the main side from where we were camped. We were doing training and conducting combined arms exercises against a national enemy. For those of you who don't know, the military uses the word national as a fancy way of saying pretend. Anyways, we were maybe 4 or 5 days into our 2-week op. We had started just on the other side of the mountains from the main side, and now we were deep in the back of the training area near a mountain known as the Crater. It was the tallest mountain in the training area, and you could see it from miles around. It looked just like all the other mountains, except at the top of this one was a massive crater, and the whole thing was black. According to the legend, the crater is where the devil hit the ground when God cast him out of heaven. This being that Joshua trees only grow in 2 places in the world, Judea and 29 Palms, and since Judea was considered a holy area, that must mean that 29 Palms was the exact opposite. Many also think this is why the cult that is located in that area set up shop there. If you ever talk to anyone who's been out there near the base of the blacktop, they will tell you that when you're near the mountain, you get a really uneasy feeling like you're constantly being watched. Some guys even get sick enough that they have to be taken back to the hospital on the main side, but as soon as they get away from the mountain, they're fine. Well, me and my friend were on watch, and we were tasked with guarding the ammo and fuel truck, so we each got a mag of live rounds when we went out to the center where the LT was. He told us that nothing unusual has happened, but that we should take a couple of radios just in case. We nodded and each grabbed one that had a green light from the charger. Then we set out to our sector and got cozy for the night. We were just getting settled in when I noticed something through my NVGs. I tapped my buddy and said, "Hey man, do you see that moving around over there?" He looked at where I was pointing and nodded. "Yeah, what is that?" "I don't know, but it looks like a person running around out there." He nodded in agreement, so I grabbed my radio and relayed back to the lieutenant what we were seeing, and I asked if there were any other units nearby. He said no, that the closest one was about a 30-minute drive away. I asked him what he wanted us to do if they got any closer. He told us to leave them alone and not draw any attention to ourselves. I nodded and was about to say out when my buddy piped up and said, "I think it's a little too late for that. They're coming this way." I quickly relayed that back to the lieutenant, and there was a long pause, and he came back with, "Keep an eye on them." "We're getting the hell out of here." Me and my friend looked up at each other in a confused manner and then shrugged. About this time, my gut was telling me to get out of there, but I forced my body to stay put and shut my brain up. I looked down my sight just as whoever it was began sprinting at us. Behind us, I could hear Marines waking up and vehicles starting. I got back on the radio and relayed to LT what was going on. I got caught off guard when the OIC, officer in charge, a major, got on the radio. Whoever they are, drop that SOB. We'll come back tomorrow to pick up the body and see who the hell they are." Before he even finished his sentence, me and my buddy both fired 2 or 3 rounds. We watched as 3 or 4 hit the figure, and they went down. We breathed a sigh of relief as I watched the figure go down. I radioed back in that the individual was down, and we were told to come back to the trucks and load it. We quickly got out of our fighting hole and dashed for our 7-ton, and the entire unit tore out of there. The next morning, which was really maybe 3 or 4 hours after the incident, the OIC sent me and my buddy, along with 3 other Marines and 4 gun trucks, out to where we had shot the figure the night before. When we got there was no body. Just a bunch of footprints all across the desert sand. However, in the exact spot we had seen the figure go down was an outline of a body in the sand. But it gets even weirder. In that same spot, there were footprints leading away and back towards the crater. To this day, I don't know what me and my friend saw that night. All I know is that my unit never conducted any more field ops even remotely close to that area of the base. Well, we both saw it go down and didn't get back up. We assumed that it was dead. Bigfoot creature seen by an airman. In the spring of 1974, Edwards Air Force Base security policeman Sergeant Michael House was on night patrol on the outskirts of the powerful communication site which maintains radio contact with other military installations around the globe. A nearby microwave tower, looming like a lonely sentinel in the darkness, stood surrounded by a wooden fence posted with signs advising that explosive devices, electronically operated or magnetically charged, would detonate within a certain radius. Sergeant House was patrolling in the area of the abandoned sled track, once used for G-force testing, when he saw it. Here is the report in his own words. Sergeant M. House. I'd gotten a new spotlight and I was trying it out. Heading back to the main base, I noticed maybe 200 to 300 yards to my left, these large blue eyes. I do a lot of night hunting and it was strange. These eyes were larger than anything I'd seen before. Their diameter had to be at least 4 inches apart and 7 feet off the ground. I stopped the truck and I sat there watching them. It was too dark to see any body shape to the thing. The blue glows came toward my truck at a right angle about 100 yards and then stopped. The hair bristled on the back of my neck as the larger-than-human eyes began circling and again moving closer to the vehicle. A rank smell like something rotten permeated the air. The thing moved closer again, now coming within 50 yards of the truck. But still, its shape could not be discerned through the brush in the desert. Just at that moment, the truck radio advised Sergeant House that he should proceed directly back to the main base, and he quickly left the area. He returned 3 hours later, but there was no trace of the blue eyes. Rain washed out the possibility of locating any tracks the following day. Sergeant House recalled, the movement of the eyes was extremely fast. Another thing that bothered me was that the eyes didn't bob up and down. It was like 2 lights on a wire moving from one point to another. He was ribbed a good deal while making out his official report on the incident, which was set to the standard of non-reporting from other patrols that encountered strange things in subsequent months. The commanding officer wanted to believe these men were simply over-imaginative. After all, the desert could produce some eerie effects at night, and reports of fantastic creatures in and around restricted areas didn't look good in the official log. You're only hearing the wind, he told the men staffing the Mars station on the midnight shift, who said they had been hearing unusual sounds, as well as seeing the dark form of something walk past the building. A figure which would have had to have been at least 8 feet tall to have been seen through the high windows. If there were official investigations by the OSI, the men on patrol seldom heard the outcome unless there was some natural explanation. Thus, they wondered about the rumor circulating that the 3 men on duty at the complex near the bombing range had called in for help. As the story went, when the patrol arrived, they found security guards unconscious. The door leading into the building was ripped off its hinges and the sophisticated electronic equipment within had been demolished. This account was told to an air policeman by a member of the patrol investigating that call for help. The Rocket Propulsion Lab lies on the eastern edge of Edwards Air Force Base and utilizes a vast area of the facility. It contains installations ranging from gigantic multi-million-pound thrust rocket stands to smaller, highly specialized test equipment which can capture and instantaneously analyze the exhaust gas produced by a rocket engine. It is here that rockets and similar hardware are tested for the study of propulsion equipment under conditions of long-term exposure to the environment. It is also here that weapon systems are developed and tested. Certain areas are off limits to civilians, and signs warn to keep out of the potentially toxic areas. Air Police Sergeant Barton had an open mind about creatures. His relatives in Missouri had seen and shot the mammoth Bigfoot-like monster known as Momo. And though he trusted their accounts of the incident, he also realized the doubt and ridicule they were subjected to when they talked about it. As a result, no formal report was made to the Air Security Police concerning what had happened in the winter of 1974 while Barton was on patrol in the vicinity of the Rocket Propulsion Laboratory and the strange blue lights he saw in the nearby mountains. Assuming the lights to be from a car, Barton drove towards them in order to intercept any unauthorized trespassers. The lights vanished when he arrived to the site where he had last seen them, but now he found his vehicle mired in the soft desert sand. Walking approximately 2 miles back to the base, the sergeant intercepted a patrol and they radioed for a tow truck. When the truck arrived and everyone returned to the sergeant's vehicle, they found 3 towed tracks measuring 14 inches long, with what appeared to be a clawed digit at the heel. The wind was blowing the soft sand and the footprints were filling in rapidly, making any precise identifications difficult. But whatever it was that left the track had completely circled the truck as if inspecting it, and then walked off on 2 legs into the desert. 3 weeks later, and also on patrol, Air Patrol Sergeant Jones was parked in the region of the rocket site. It was close to midnight. The moon was up when suddenly Jones noticed a shape moving across the skyline on a nearby hill. While he couldn't estimate its height, the trunk area or girth was described as immense. The sergeant quickly grabbed his radio microphone and called HQ. "Tell the replacement to hurry up. I might need some help," he urged. As Jones looked back up the hill again, 2 large luminescent green-blue orbs, like eyes, were moving towards him. They didn't really seem to be like they were bouncing the way a person would when walking. They kind of floated along or were on an easy glide. Car lights appeared down the road and the patrolman lost no time getting out of his truck and walking to meet the vehicle. At that moment, he was extremely grateful that the men had responded so quickly to his call for help. But that wasn't actually so. The other vehicle had been ordered into the area in response to a report about strange lights being observed in the hills. Yet no unauthorized cars had been located and now the glowing eyes had disappeared. All that remained in the vicinity were the unusual marks on the ground. The 2 rounded depressions measured 6 inches and 2 inches in diameter respectively. There were foot tracks as well. They were all over the place, Jones said. There were so many of them, I couldn't follow any trail. Barton, who had found tracks around his truck a few weeks earlier, said they were similar to what I had seen. The other man on the patrol didn't get out of the car. He said he didn't want anything to do with it.